Good afternoon. Welcome to the CVA and VoteVets United for a Better Foreign Policy Luncheon. We're very excited to have you here. My name is Nate Anderson. I'm the Executive Director for Concerned Veterans for America. I want to thank you all for coming out and participating. Very special thanks to our guest speakers, our panelists that are here with us today, Hill staffers, members of the media, and other guests. Thanks very much for coming. I also want to recognize the members of Concerned Veterans for America and VoteVets who are sitting with us here today. These fantastic individuals came in from all over the country. Many of them drove long distances to be here. And over the past couple of days, together, VoteVets and CVA have been hitting the hill. They've been going to meetings on the House and Senate side, meeting with lawmakers and their staffs with one question. And that question was this: will you work with us to find and realize a better foreign policy for the United States? I think that's something that military veterans, their family members are uniquely qualified to do. So I want to thank all of you who came a long way to be here, participate with us, for your hard work and dedication. It's really been a pleasure to see the two organizations working together, so thank you very much. I'm an Army veteran, Green Beret, Afghanistan war veteran. I first signed up in 2004, back when the Iraq conflict was but a year old. We were not even 3 years into the Afghanistan conflict. Had you told me way back then, 2004, that we would still be on the ground in Afghanistan in 2019, I don't think I would have believed you. I would have probably said you're a little crazy, but we remain in 18 years into the longest conflict in U.S. history. And that's why we're here today, to talk about these forever wars in which the United States has spent trillions of dollars, in which thousands of Americans have lost their lives fighting, and with real no end in sight. You know, we continue to deploy our men and women who risk their lives for this nation. And what we want to do here is set the stage for an honest conversation about foreign policy, about how the United States engages in the world generally, both our successes, our failures, and how we can realize a smarter foreign policy by rethinking the way that we approach our U.S. foreign policy around the world. And I think that, as you can see from CVA and VoteVets working together, this is not a partisan issue. If you know anything about our organizations, you know that we disagree on a lot of things, and that's okay. But I think that if you were to be in these meetings that we conducted over the last 2 days, you would quickly realize this truly is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that many, many people on both sides of the aisle agree on. The significance here is we're willing to put our differences aside and come together because this shared mission that we have is worth the effort, it's worth fighting for. It's really encouraging, like I said, to watch our organizations lead by example, come together, put our differences aside, because I think that too is something that veterans are uniquely qualified to do, leading by example. So thank you again for being here. I think that this is going to be a productive and worthwhile discussion. And I'm going to welcome up Dan Caldwell. Dan Caldwell is our senior advisor at Concerned Veterans for America. Dan?
Thank you, Nate. For time purposes, I'm going to roll right into it. I am honored to moderate a panel of experts on various parts of our foreign policy, particularly on how Congress can reassert itself in how they shape American foreign policy, people who have been practitioners of our foreign policy in the military. So rolling right into it, I want to welcome to the stage Rachel Bovard. Rachel is currently the Senior Director at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She previously worked for the Heritage Foundation and also spent 10 years on the Hill working on both the House and Senate side. I wanted Rachel to come today because she has been somebody who's written a lot about how there's been kind of a breakdown in the legislative process in both the House and Senate side on a whole host of issues, but particularly on foreign policy. She's also a senior fellow with Defense Priorities Initiative, which is a great organization. I recommend you follow them as well. I also like to welcome to the stage Will Ruger, Dr. Will Ruger. I work with Will. In addition to my work at Concerned Veterans for America, I work with a new organization you probably heard about called Stand Together, which is part of the Koch network. Will, in addition to managing our foreign policy initiatives at Stand Together, also manages foreign policy and research as a vice president at the Charles Koch Institute. Will was previously a professor. Don't hold that against him. But he also is currently an officer in the United States Naval Reserve and is also a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. And finally, but not least, I'd like to welcome to the stage Major General Paul Eaton. General Eaton is part of VoteVets. He served over 30 years in the United States military, and he served in Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia. He served in the early part of the Iraq War, and he's been very outspoken on avoiding the mistakes that we've made in Iraq, and hopefully we don't make again in future conflicts. He's also the first Major General who's told me to call him by his first name. So that's something I'll have to get used to. So Paul, I apologize if I lapse back into Major General, but I'm going to move over here to the chair. Can everybody hear me? Oh, good to go. One thing I'd like to say before I begin, and some of my staff's probably tired of hearing me say this, but it's been a real honor and pleasure working with VoteVets, but if you would have told me we'd be doing this event 3 years ago, I would have said you are smoking crack. But here we are, and it's a good thing. So I've gotten that out of my system. So Kyle, you're cringing over there in the corner with Nate, and so it's out of my system now. There we go. So I'd like this first question to go to Rachel. Rachel, in the post 9/11 era, with a few notable exceptions like the recent vote on Yemen, Congress has really been absent in the debate around foreign policy, and there's been a real aversion to vote on matters of war and peace. Do you think it's a political issue, a leadership issue, or a process issue, or is it an all-of-above issue?
I think it's a little bit of an all-of-the-above issue, but I think it goes back to the basic idea that Congress doesn't want to take accountability for our wars anymore. And this is partly a process thing. Congress sets it up so that they don't have to take responsibility, and this starts with the spending process. You see them earmark billions of dollars to the executive completely unrestrained for the executive to make all kinds of choices about war and peace. So that's something that doesn't ever change. But then when Congress does want to assert itself, and I think you saw this most recently with the vote on Yemen, when Congress does want to assert itself, you have this very tight cabal of whoever it is, congressional leadership, I think with some of the foreign policy establishment, some of the defense establishment says, no, we cannot have this vote. We cannot debate it. We don't want to talk about it. And I think Yemen is a perfect example of this. What we're referring to is the War Powers resolution that was brought to the floor by a congressman from Kentucky named Thomas Massey at the end of last year. And under the War Powers Act, he said he had the right to raise this resolution of disapproval and saying, we disapprove of the executive's actions placing U.S. assistance in Yemen, and we disapprove of it, and we want to take a vote on it. There was an active bipartisan effort to shut him up, and it was very successful. Basically, in parliamentary terms, they stripped the resolution of privilege. Under the War Powers Resolution, he was entitled to the vote. He could force it. They said, no, you cannot. And his vote was, the ability for him to raise that vote was removed. And a similar thing happened to Senator Mike Lee in the Senate when he brought up a similar resolution. So there is a bipartisan effort, and it's not partisan, it's really not. It's from both sides to stop these debates from ever happening. And I think it goes back to, again, they don't want to take accountability for it. But second, there is a very significant view within the foreign policy and defense establishments that Congress shouldn't play a role in this. So until we start encouraging members to force these votes to have this debate, it's still going to be a sideshow, in Congress, and most of the decision making is going to be left unchecked to the executive.
Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think, though, is encouraging is that you have more and more people on Capitol Hill being willing to stick their neck out on this issue. That's one of the reasons why, and we'll talk a little bit later, why I think restraint is something that hasn't seen its best days. Its best days are ahead of them because more and more people are coming to this. And so it was really great to see people like Ro Khanna, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Massey, others really kind of sticking their neck out and going for it on Yemen this year and being quite successful. Now, again, given the way our system works and with the executive being able to veto this, we didn't get where we needed to. But I think the fact is that there's more and more energy around these types of issues on Capitol Hill.
General Eaton?
Is this auto? Yeah. It's automatic. Warfare really does need to be an interactive operation between civilians and the military. Don't trust your generals entirely, and don't trust the civilians entirely. It's got to be interactive. Let's go back to World War II. The generals wanted to go into the continent in 1942. And President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill said, not so fast, lads. We're going to go into North Africa. We're going to figure out how to fight the Germans. And once we get our act together and, man trained, equipped to do so, then we will go into the continent of Europe. That decision avoided an absolute bloodbath and the possibility that we'd all be speaking German right now. So it's an interactive process. The generals have their say, the civilians have their say, and the outcome will be better for it if we actually make it so. And that also tends to share accountability, which is appropriate when the nation chooses to use military force.
All right, well, thank you. Will, I'm going to start with you on this next question. So you've been involved in the foreign policy space as an academic, as an advocate, working on Capitol Hill and working with think tanks around Washington, D.C., and as a practitioner in the Naval Reserve. Are you optimistic that with some of the regional congressional actions around foreign policy, with Yemen, with the election of Donald Trump, with what he has articulated, a more unconventional approach to foreign policy, are you optimistic that we're moving towards a different place with the foreign policy debate, especially in the post-Cold War era?
Yes, I am. I think realism and restraint is going to be more and more important in the national conversation as we go forward. And I would say that for three primary reasons. One, if you recall, Patrick Henry talked about the importance of the lamp of experience. And I think that the last 15 to 25 years have really lit the way to the future. And unfortunately, the lamp of experience has taught us that the way we've been approaching the world has not been working. If you think about what we've been doing over the last 25 years, whether it's wars in the Balkans, whether it's the debacle of the Iraq War, whether it's the debacle of Libya, whether it's the nation-building project in Afghanistan that hasn't reached the goals that we had set, these are all things where American foreign policy hasn't been working to make us safer. And I think the American public understands that, and they're weary of these types of wars. And so I think they're going to look at restraint as an alternative that can make us safe, maintain the conditions of our prosperity, and protect our liberal society here at home. And I think that's what Americans will cotton on to, right? They'll be very eager to have a new approach given the failures of the past. The second thing is that there's a lot of bipartisan energy around this, and we're seeing that here today with the groups assembled. And so given you have a bipartisan coalition, I think it could become a dominant approach to the world in the same way containment, which was a bipartisan approach, was able to. And before that, Washington's Great Rule, which was the idea that the United States should be very careful about how it engages in the world. And that dominated in a bipartisan fashion. So I'm excited by the bipartisan nature of this coalition. And then third is that there are important changes happening in the world that are going to make restraint more likely. Okay? It's not inevitable, but more likely. One of these is the rise of different types of technology that make conquest and offensive action harder. Things like anti-access area denial technologies that are going to make it more difficult for the United States to engage forward. A second thing that's going to be a real constraint, I think, is our budget issue, right? Our debt and deficits. The fact is that we're over $20 trillion in debt, and that should pinch in a realistic world, and it will eventually. I really believe that. And then I think thirdly is that the American public is, with a majority of the American public, they feel that what we've been doing, again, hasn't made us safe, and they're going to reach for different margins. And we saw that with Trump going to South Carolina and really pushing this line about the Iraq War being a debacle, about the problems of the Bush administration and the Obama administration in terms of its foreign policy of primacy. And I think the fact that he lived to tell about it and then became president shows that political leaders can actually run on these issues and win.
Rachel, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just, to Will's last point about sort of this beginning to resonate, I think, with the American public, the Eurasia Group came out with a really interesting study, I think it was last month, that basically showed a huge divergence between the opinion of what they define as the foreign policy elite. And again, these are people who publish regularly, probably people Will knows, I don't know, and the rest of America, and they polled citizens, and there was a huge divergence between what those foreign policy elite thought we should be doing in terms of engagement overseas and what the rest of the public thought. And it's not hard to figure out, right? The foreign policy elite were very pro-engagement, pro-defending, our NATO partners, all these things, and the American public were not. And especially on the question of NATO, they said, when they said, should we engage to defend Montenegro? I mean, it was very, very split on that issue, and it's going to be very hard, I think, to sustain this idea of engagement around the world just on the whim of an executive when you have a public that doesn't necessarily support it. So I think it's going to force a lot of that debate and dialogue that hasn't been happening on these questions.
General Eaton, anything to add?
Sure. Shortly after World War II, the 800-pound gorilla in this town was the Secretary of State. It was not the Secretary of Defense. Since then, and with the acceleration of the military-industrial complex, we have watched an abdication of foreign policy to the hands of the military. We have seen the erosion of foreign policy execution shift from Foggy Bottom over to across the river to the Pentagon. Entirely inappropriate for a country of our sophistication to do that. But President Eisenhower's outgoing speech was unfortunately blown away by a brilliant President, John F. Kennedy. But those of us old enough to remember that speech, and I actually am old enough to remember that speech because my dad made me listen to it, but we have seen the erosion of the State Department's entirely appropriate management of diplomatic action in the world. And the 535 advocates for the Pentagon ensure that the Pentagon will never run out of money, even at the pain of our State Department, our diplomats, and every other department in this town for what they can do for the United States and for what they can do to the world. So I'm not looking for a budget decrease for the Pentagon. I'm looking for smarter spending of money, and it starts with the State Department.
General Eaton, I'm going to stay with you for this next question. So you served as a general officer in the lead up to the Iraq War, and then you served in Iraq in the early years of the war. Quite simply, are you seeing any parallels to the lead up to the war in Iraq that we're seeing currently with Iran, or is it a totally different dynamic?
Well, there are parallels, and when you look at warfare, and I mentioned earlier that it's really an interactive approach with our civilian leadership and our military leadership. And it's how you manage intelligence, how you manage the art of war over in the Pentagon. Every general officer winds up going to the War College at the age of about 42 to 44. You are welcome to the War College thusly. welcome practitioners of the military art. We're going to talk about all the other tools of American power, of national power. Then they started talking about interests, the interest of a country. Countries don't have friends. Countries have interests. And they go from existential interest to vital, to conditional, to simply, well, maybe. And it's useful to get that right, and we frequently don't. We didn't get it right in Iraq, and we had a series of unfortunate events that worked with our intel system, a failure to collaborate between agencies, a failure to corroborate intel sources and methods. So we had an intel failure. And then we had a leadership failure where the United States did not understand they had a mismatch of interests. Iraq was not a vital national interest. Yet, we approached it so, and we didn't do resource unaddressed. We gave it plenty of resources, but we failed to take into account that Saddam viewed what we were doing as an existential interest. And that creates different dynamics on the battlefield. We failed to, as a nation, we failed to sit generals down and say, what's your plan? What are your assumptions? And you get into military planning. It's all about, the plan doesn't survive first contact, and plans all have assumptions. Each assumption has to have a contingency plan if you have an assumption that fails. We assumed, one of the assumptions was that Iraqi society would remain essentially intact, their government would, and their bureaucracy would remain essentially intact. But that assumption failed. We did not have a contingency plan to address that. We also had a Secretary of Defense tell Tommy Franks, who is arguably, I hope no relatives are here, but the dumbest four-star we have ever created, told Tommy Franks, you will not plan for the sequel, the what's next. So when Buff Blunt, the commanding general of the 3rd Infantry Division, watched the boil happen in Baghdad and a complete breakdown in society in Baghdad, he did not have the sequel. He didn't have plan for the aftermath, phase 4, if you will, of military planning. So between our civilian leadership ordering or giving a bad order and a 4-star general, and ladies and gentlemen, 4-star generals are the interface between policy deciders and policy executors. So when the 4-star caves the way Tommy Franks did, then you get the insurgency that killed so many Americans and killed so many Iraqis. And I would just ask everybody, remember interactive. It's got to be back and forth, and you got to have the guts to stand up to your civilian leaders.
Will?
Yeah, I'm not worried that this is going to be like 2003. In 2002, 2003, there was a big build-up. Pretty much everybody in Washington was on board, and there was an attempt to create a spark. They were going to just do this, right? I think the worry now is that what the administration could be doing, or at least some people within the administration, because I think there are people who don't want this, and hopefully they'll prevail. But I think what they'll try to do is to create the conditions under which there would be a spark that would provide an argument for why the United States needs to hit back. Whether that's something that happens in Syria because American troops are still there, and I don't think there's a good reason for them to be there, or there'll be a conflict in the Persian Gulf, or there'll be a situation in which the things that we're doing actively to put constraints on Iran, and whether those are well-intentioned or otherwise, the fact is these things can pinch Iran, and that Iran will do something stupid, right, that will then cause the United States to be able to push back, whether that's ramping up or re-ramping up a nuclear program, and that causes the United States to be able to make an argument for war. So I worry about that we're putting the kind of tinder in the kind of fireplace for a spark to happen. And that's why I think we really need to make the case for why we need more diplomacy, that hopefully President Trump will step up and try to cut through and against some of the bureaucratic actors who would like to see this tinder be set on fire, perhaps. And so hopefully that can be managed, and we can kind of see what we saw Thursday and Friday, where President Trump said, I hope not, right, when it came to the question of whether we should have war. And when we saw people in this town really worrying about the fact that we might rush there through a cause that is provoked by these kind of conditions we're setting on the ground.
Rachel, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, again, this is a president who said multiple times on the campaign trail he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. You're hearing him say it now, but again, I think he's surrounded by some people who may feel differently. But at the end of the day, you cannot constrain an executive without an equally empowered Congress. And this is a point where Congress needs to start engaging now. It's one thing for them to give lip service to it, to criticize Trump, to say, we don't want to do this. Don't let them off the hook for that, because they have the ability to constrain the executive. They're the ones holding the purse strings. They're starting this current appropriations process. We're going to see a defense appropriations bill on the floor. What kind of restraints is Congress going to put on the executive, Republican or Democrat, on what they're able to do with that money? Again, just to kind of bring it full circle, we see some of this now, as both Will and I have spoken about. You're seeing members of Congress now stepping up and saying we shouldn't be here. Maybe we shouldn't be selling our weapon systems to countries that are going to use it inappropriately or suck us into armed conflict. But they're still on the periphery. We haven't gotten to the point where these are considered conversations worth having in the United States Congress. And so until we can get to that point, Congress isn't going to weigh itself. It's not going to live itself up to its Article 1 responsibility. And so the more that can be communicated to Congress to tell them they're responsible for this too, I think the better it is for us engaging around the world.
And just one more thing, Dan. I mean, Rachel and I are talking about how there's some disagreements perhaps within the administration. Well, I think that the president would be well served to have more people within his administration making the case for a more restrained approach to these issues. Unfortunately, I think there's an imbalance there. And that doesn't mean that there isn't anyone there, but having more people, I think, that agree with what President Trump said in South Carolina, what he said in his Mayflower speech here in Washington about the importance of greater realism in our foreign policy, that's critical. Those people need to be in there.
So, Rachel and Will, your answers, I think, actually set up the next question that I wanted to ask all three of you. And Will, I'm going to start with you on this question. So within Washington and really across the country, we have a foreign policy establishment. The former national security or deputy national security advisor for President Obama called it the blob. In all honesty, I think that it's subjective who qualifies as part of the blob, but I think we can all agree there is a foreign policy establishment. And one thing that I've felt about this foreign policy establishment is that it is full of people and is really run by people who have been consistently wrong about just about everything in the post-Cold War era in regards to foreign policy. These people get high-profile columnist jobs. They get high-profile positions within both Republican and Democrat administrations. They still advise presidential candidates, members of Congress. Why is there a complete lack of accountability for the foreign policy establishment in the United States?
I think one place to start actually is that I think the people who advocated vociferously for the Iraq War, many of them, they don't have a lot of shame about what they did and what they said. If I had advocated for that war, had written books in favor of that war, and then it had turned out the way it did, I would have left this town. I would have gone back to the hills and taken up farming. It just was not, it's just amazing that people are still jumping out there with the confidence that they have after being wrong in case after case. And then the other thing is why are people demanding that supply? Now, I know that there's a status quo bias in cities like this, but look to new voices. Why not try to find people who actually might be right about these things? At least give them a chance. I mean, I'd like to see, guys like Barry Posen at MIT, or a whole host of people that write at places like the Skeptics blog on the national interest, right? These are people who should have columns at more established newspapers because they've actually been right about things over the last 20 years.
Real quickly, our next speaker's here, but Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
I think part of it is that because we don't see enough debate on these issues, they don't resonate beyond the blob. They don't resonate beyond Washington, D.C. and the Beltway. So it's hard, I think, sometimes when elections come around to force people to care, to force people to realize, hey, we've been wrong a lot on these issues. And so I think the more we talk about them, the more debate we have, the better it's going to be for people in the national consensus, when they're voting in the election booths to say, hey, maybe those guys who messed it up for the last 15 years, maybe we shouldn't give them another chance.
Appreciate it. General Eaton, and any last words?
We just have to see the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate step up to the plate and provide the oversight requirements that the Constitution gave them. And there's been an abdication of that. There's been a failure on the part of our Senate and on the part of our House to manage outcomes in the foreign policy arena.
All right, well, thank you all. This is an outstanding panel. Could you please give them a round of applause? And now to introduce our next speaker, going to have John Soltz from VoteVets come up. John is somebody that for many years, obviously, we sparred with, but over the past few months, it's been a real pleasure to get to know him. Although he was making fun of my G-Shock watch. I still have a tactical G-Shock watch, and I'm not afraid to admit it. But he was making fun of that today. But we're getting our next speaker here. It's Senator Udall. Again, John's going to introduce him here. We're very blessed that all these speakers could come today. There is a lot going on in Capitol Hill. Obviously, you had the president speak this morning. You have a lot of hearings and whatnot, and we're really honored that all these members from both sides of the aisle could come and join us today. Also, really honored that we had members of the press join us today. We got Leo Shane here. We got others that have covered us, and there's a lot of other places they could be. We're glad they're here. So I'd like to welcome to the stage John Soltz to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Dan. I think some of you all know me, some don't. Some of you hated me, so I don't hate any of you. I'm going to stand up here and tell you guys are all great. First, I just want to thank everyone who came to the veterans. If there's one thing we love to do at VoteVets, is to give you guys a voice and get you out there. We've been at this since 2006, coming up here, and it's always an honor when you allow veterans to participate in the political process. And one of the offices that we've really gotten to know and work with over the years is Senator Udall, and just been a great advocate on foreign policy. Some of you guys know, in 2011 I went to Iraq. I was on my second tour, and I happened to be in northern Iraq, probably about 100 miles from the Syrian border. And VoteVets has often taken sides that are ideological, but at times we challenge the Obama administration on putting more troops in Afghanistan, and one on Syria, and whether or not we were to intervene in Syria, or whether or not we were just going to give AT-4 rockets to the insurgents in Syria. And one of our biggest supporters on that push initially in 2012 when I got back was Senator Udall. And we had a great honor of writing an op-ed. He's been with us for years, and absolutely one of our best advocates to have a more restrained foreign policy. Unfortunately, he's leaving the U.S. Senate, but nonetheless, we're really honored to have him here, and I was just going to ask you guys to give him a standing ovation. Senator?
John, thank you. Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. It's really dangerous when you get my wife always reminds me, standing O at the beginning, because if you do that, then, if it doesn't happen at the end, then you're in trouble. But anyway, thank you, John. It's been wonderful working with you, and he knows my daughter Amanda, who does a lot of the political work in New Mexico, and they've been good friends, and so we've known each other a long time. And I can't tell you how important it is to hear from veterans and hear your voices. I have, it goes up and down. I think I've been as high as 6. I think today I have 4 veterans on my staff. One of them here is with me, my policy guy on foreign affairs, Matt Padilla, back here. He's a Navy vet, so I don't know, yeah, okay, good. But I want to thank VoteVets and Concerned Veterans for America for organizing today's important discussion. I'm sorry I'm going to have to slip out quickly, where this vote is going to take place at 1:45, and so that's when the committee comes in, so I'm just going to speak to you and run for the door here. But your organizations, I think, have worked really hard to find common ground rooted in the Constitution's language and in trusting war powers with Congress. If we're going to end these endless wars, it's going to be through collaboration like yours. And I just can't tell you how strong and powerful your voices are. You probably saw in the last election, many veterans were elected to Congress. It reminds me a lot of my father's class to Congress in 1954. He was a World War II vet in the Army Air Corps. And boy, when they came home from World War II, I mean, the vets went into public service, and that was the greatest generation that did so much. So the veterans and servicemen and women here today, you know better than anyone the true cost of war. You and your compatriots made the sacrifice, and I really want to thank you for your service. At the outset, let's be clear about 2 things. First, the majority of the American people, our troops and their families, have no appetite for forever wars in the Middle East or any place else. They have, thank you. They have no appetite for forever wars that do not serve our national interests. They have these wars that have no clear mission or exit strategy, that cost precious American lives and cost billions of taxpayer dollars. Second, it is the American people's 535 representatives in the Congress who have the power under the Constitution to enter into war. Not one person, not even a president. It's the Congress and the 535 who sit in those seats. The framers of the Constitution were crystal clear on this point. In Article 1, Section 8, Congress and Congress alone has the power to, quote, and this quote from the Constitution, declare war. That's in the Constitution. But over recent years, Republicans and Democratic presidents alike have overstepped their constitutional ground to wage war. Administrations from both parties have stretched the meaning of Congress's authorizations to use military force to the breaking point, and Congress has allowed it to happen. We've really given up our ability, folks, to carry on a strong pushback and collaboration with the executive by not taking action on this. And this encroachment by the executive needs to end. Congress has surrendered its authority because the decision to wage war and to escalate war are tough political decisions. But the voters elected us to take tough decisions, and we need to do our job, and we need to do, in this case, our constitutional duty. This president has had Americans on the edge of their seats and the Twitter feeds wondering whether he will rain fire and fury down on North Korea, whether he will use military force to force out Maduro in Venezuela, and whether he will spiral into an unconstitutional war against Iran. I believe the American people want no part of these new military ventures. But even if you disagree, these decisions are Congress's to make, not the president's. Every day now, we are reading. Every day now, we are reading about a potential war with Iran. While Iran is a bad actor in many ways, I'm not trying to hold them up on a pedestal or anything. The administration's policies and rhetoric have needlessly increased the tensions. Let me be clear, there was no threat of war until the president made conflict more likely. And now we are in danger of the situation getting out of control. This is a conflict of the president's own making. And I can tell you from all the briefings and everything I've heard and the things that are open sources out there, we've moved into a situation where there's a very, very high element of miscalculation that could happen by the situation we're in right now. And that's why we're trying to get this thing under control. Let me be clear. This conflict is the president's own making. By unilaterally pulling out of the Iran agreement, an agreement Iran was abiding by according to the president's own military experts and all of the nuclear experts that are international that have been in there said up till today, they have been all the way from when it was signed till today, they've been in compliance. By reimposing sanctions and using sanctions authority to compel both our allies and Iran to make changes that were never part of the agreement, by labeling part of Iran's military a terrorist group in a way that brought little benefit, but I believe increases risk to our own forces. You know, if you label their military as a terrorist organization under our statutes, they do the same thing to our military, and you know what happens then. And the administration has also, by misusing intelligence and not sharing the limited intelligence with Congress, to increase the temperature in an already fraught region. So now we know that John Bolton was one of the chief architects of the Iraq War, and he has wanted regime change and war with Iran for years. I think this whole policy, and you all realize this, when other countries, when we say we don't like their president and regime change, that just has led more and more into this forever war situation. We need to not be doing that. And this maximum pressure campaign looks to me a lot like a cover to goad Iran into conflict. So one day the president doesn't want to go to war with Iran and he wants to talk. The next he threatens to annihilate an entire country. I think this Twitter foreign policy, it's erratic, it's reckless, and it's dangerous. But whether the president wants to wage war against Iran is not the question. The real question is whether the president comes to Congress to seek a declaration of war against Iran. And that's why I introduced the Prevention of Unconstitutional War with Iran Act in April, along with Senators Paul and Durbin and a number of other senators. I believe up till now we have 20 co-sponsors. So I hope you will help us with the contacts you have on the rest of the members of Congress to say, this is a good piece of legislation. It follows the Constitution. Let's let the Congress make its decision. It's bipartisan legislation that prohibits any funding for an unauthorized attack on Iran. And by the way, I do not believe that the 2001 authorization for use of military force authorizes force against Iran. No matter how much this administration stretches to connect al-Qaeda and Iran, it just doesn't work. The connection is not there. Congress must assert its constitutional authority to prevent a needless conflict with Iran, and we need groups like yours to continue to speak up about this threat. Now, our nation's forever wars have cost us too much, and we need to bring them to a close, beginning with Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan over 17 years. This is the longest war in U.S. history. We've lost over 2,300 brave men and women. 20,000 troops have been wounded in action. It's cost us, the estimate we can come up with is $2 trillion. The original mission for involvement in Afghanistan has been achieved. It's high time we bring our troops home. And that's why in March, along with Senator Paul and I, introduced the American Forces Going Home Noble Service Act, or Afghan Service Act. This act does a couple of things. Declares victory in Afghanistan, acknowledges that we have largely achieved our objectives, sets guidelines for safe and orderly withdrawal of troops, and repeals the 2001 AUMF. So in conclusion, Congress must reassert its authority and make the decisions whether or not to engage in armed conflict. I'd put forth legislation on Iran, on Afghanistan. These critical decisions demand debate on the Senate floor. We cannot continue to stick our heads in the sand. Too much, as you know very well, is at stake. Please join me in urging Congress to affirm its constitutional prerogative, to debate the critical issues of war and peace, to make the tough decisions, and to take the tough votes. We owe it to every single man and woman who puts on the American uniform to assume our constitutional duty. So thank you again for your service. I'm going to see if I'm on time here. I'm right on time. They say your operation that runs here, they said, well, we're going to have you out at 13:30. I'm out at 13:30. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Please be in touch with Matt in my office. Thank you for the second standing O.
Well, we appreciate Senator Udall for joining us. I believe we are still waiting for our next speaker. So while we're doing that, he is in the car from the House side, so he should be here any minute now. I just want to take a minute and thank some more people that made this possible. It's hard to overstate how blessed we at CVA and VoteVets are to have such great teams, respectively, in each organization, and then have so many great coalition partners as well, too. No organization can work on an issue like this alone. And so I've been really blessed as CVA has ramped up its engagement. In addition to having my own great team, to have a lot of great coalition partners. One person I'd like to recognize is Reed Smith here, who works at Charles Koch Institute and now the new Stand Together organization that I referenced earlier. He really was critical behind the scenes in helping pull together this partnership with VoteVets. Somebody who I've turned to get guidance on congressional authorization for use of military force, help better understand that issue. I've been real grateful for his partnership. Chris Preble from the Cato Institute, somebody who's been working in this space for a long time. I've always admired his work. I encourage you to check out the good work he's doing with the rest of the folks at Cato. The VoteVets team, I believe, was introduced earlier, working with Rick and Kate, and then Will Fisher, a fellow Marine. Will helped pull together the whole Hill fly-in. He worked with Will Wetzel. There's so many Wills flowing around. We have Will Ruger, Will Wetzel, Will Fisher, 3 W's. So he unfortunately had to fly back last night, but he was a critical partner helping to pull this whole thing together, helping schedule meetings, fly in the rest of the VoteVets team, and then all the folks from VoteVets that joined us and walked side by side with us on Capitol Hill. I've joined a few meetings. It was great. And it was really great experience. And again, something I wouldn't have imagined doing years ago. We also have Juliana from our policy team. Juliana worked on the Hill for many years. We're honored to have her as our director of policy. She actually took my old job several years ago with CVA. And then Kelly Merkel, who you've probably seen running around. She's helping shuttle people through, so she's probably not going to hear this. Kelly has driven our Vets on the Hill efforts now for many years, and Kelly is John said earlier, it sounds like she's always talking on the radio. Kelly didn't serve in the military, but she worked for the Commandant of the Marine Corps in the Department of Defense for about 5-6 years, and her husband recently retired after 23 years in the United States Marine Corps, and she has been a driving force in our Capitol Hill efforts. She jumped right into the job and is really a critical member of the team. Olivia, who's our operations coordinator, she was another key person in pulling this all together. And then finally, our general counsel back there in the back, Colonel Herb Ford, he knows what's coming. Retired JAG officer. If you've seen this series, JAG, it's based off of his life. I tell that at every event. It never gets old for me, but I can tell you it is definitely old for Herb. But this isn't, Concerned Veterans for America isn't just me and Nate, and VoteVets isn't just John. We have a lot of great people supporting us, and I'm really blessed for that. If you'd like to learn more about Concerned Veterans for America, you can obviously go to www.cv4a.org. You can follow us on Facebook at Concerned Veterans for America, and at Twitter at Concerned Vets. And then John's better at this than I am. VoteVets.org obviously is the place you can find out more about VoteVets. Those of you in the Washington, D.C. area, I can tell you with CVA, we have a great Virginia chapter. We have actually a few folks here from our Virginia chapter and our partners at Americans for Prosperity. We're always doing a lot of great events, so please join us as well. We're hoping to have more DC events as well. We're still waiting for some of our speakers here, but is Congressman Davidson here? And with that, I'm going to have John Soltz, is he coming back in? Okay. Actually, well, I hope John's not mad I get to steal this introduction, but actually, I first heard about Congressman Rose prior to him being elected for Congress because one of Nate and I's predecessors in the role of Executive Director for Concerned Veterans for America, Mark Lucas, co-wrote an op-ed with Congressman Rose prior to him even running for Congress on criminal justice reform. And he is an Army Ranger. He is still serving in the National Guard. And he has become a very active voice for veterans in Washington and has been willing to step up on the issue of foreign policy. So we're always happy to see veterans from both sides of the aisle step up and make sure their voice is heard in this important process. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Congressman Max Rose.
It's just like John Soltz to bail out on introing me, man. Where is this guy? Come on, bro. Shit. You know, the thing about Mr. Soltz is that he's a colonel or a light colonel, and I'm a captain. So he I should be doing push-ups for him. I do just want to say something about, first of all, CVA. You know, Mark Lucas, he's not here, so it's kind of odd. But him and I are dear friends. And this partnership that we built up, you know, doing with this editorial and continued advocacy around criminal justice reform is part of the reason why I ran for office. You know, when I talked to Mark, you know, he sometimes thinks I'm one step to the right of Karl Marx. And when I talk to him, I sometimes think he's one step to the left of Attila the Hun. But we still have this shared bond as, you know, Ranger qualified officers, as infantrymen, as vets. And we didn't decide to dedicate our lives to public service so that we could pontificate all day long. We wanted to actually get something done, and I know you all share that sentiment in the room, and there's nothing that better evinces that than this partnership between CVA and VoteVets, and I'm just truly honored to be a part of this. This is what we need in this town, in this country, because our culture has become so incredibly broken, and there's no better example of that than what's going on with the AUMF. Congress, for the last 20 years, 18 years, has become obsessed and addicted to undeclared war. You know, to put things into perspective, we will have soldiers enlisting in the United States military this year, this September, who were not born on 9/11. The vast majority of your average infantry platoon, your average infantry company, does not remember 9/11. We have waged war in over 20 different countries, killed people on the books in over 20 countries, let alone what we've done in other operations based off one authorization for military force that is nearly 20 years old. And Congress, for the most part, seems okay with it. For the most part, Congress, and this is both parties, seems okay with complete dereliction of duty. It is, as a veteran, and I know many of you share this sentiment, it is so incredibly odd to see. And now we see this again with what's going on with Iran. Again, we see ourselves inching towards war. And the second, all they have to do is mention Al-Qaeda. That's it. That's it. And suddenly it's justified based off this issue. So what do we do with AUMF? Well, I got an idea. It's called repeal and replace. That's branding. I learned that from my Republican friends. This is not a matter of whether you consider yourself a pacifist or not. That has nothing to do with this. This is not about ideology. This is about responsibility. This is about Congress asserting its role so that we can play a role at the table and hold presidents accountable irrespective of what political party they're in. It's about upholding the Constitution. It's why so many of you in this room put on our nation's uniform and still do. This should not be complicated. This should not be hard. But what it is required to do is to actually have leaders at the table. Oh, what's up, buddy? That's awesome. So I look forward to working with you all. Count me in. I don't need credit. You can blame it all on the Democrats, blame it all on the Republicans. Let's just get this thing changed. So thank you again.
We are apparently still waiting on Congressman Davidson. So I'd just like to say I think Nate will appreciate this joke, but as we know, he's here. Well, I'd just like to say that officers have a tendency to get lost. So I got that out of my system again. Anyways, I'm now honored to introduce Congressman Davidson. And Congressman Davidson is actually somebody just like Congressman Rose that I first heard of and met before he was elected to Congress. And he came to one of our events in Ohio. I think our Ohio team is sitting up here. Steve put it on. It was in Cleveland. It was around the VA. And he was running for office, and he sat in the back quietly. He didn't, campaign, which is, we obviously are a nonpartisan organization. We can't have campaign activities occurring at our event. But he sat in the back and he just listened and learned. And he came up after and introduced himself, and he asked for a card and some more information, and he took it. And he was running for Congress to replace, at the time, Speaker Boehner, who had resigned his seat. So he's elected and won in 2016, and was, as a result, because it was a vacant seat, he came into office in the middle of 2016 off cycle. And so right away, his office reached out to us, started to engage us on a variety of issues, particularly reforming the Department of Veterans Affairs, but recently has become more involved and more engaged in the foreign policy discussion. Congressman Davidson is a veteran himself. He served first as an enlisted infantryman, and then he received an appointment to West Point, and then he served as an officer. So, well, I guess I got to take back my joke then, because he was both enlisted and officer. But and then after that, he returned to Ohio, continued to build a successful family business, and then when Speaker Boehner resigned, decided to step up and run for Congress, and we are very lucky to have him there. And he's been, again, somebody who's been willing to step up, take on some tough issues, challenge the status quo, and is definitely not there to go along to get along. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Congressman Warren Davidson.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the chance to speak with you all, and thank you all for the service to our country. So, a lot of the intro was already done, but I joined the Army back when the Cold War was going on. I enlisted in graduated high school in '88, got sent to Germany, got to be there when the wall came down. It was a pretty amazing thing. Back then, it was we had a clear-cut foreign policy. There were still differences around the country, but we were unified in terms of what it meant to project American power and why it was important. And essentially that same thing, same ideology led to East and West Germany being reunified. We saw the clear distinction and still today on the Korean Peninsula, why North Korea is a clear, stark contrast to South Korea. And it was an ideological battle that we sometimes used force in places around the world. But since the end of the Cold War, we've been, frankly, wandering around in the grand strategy wilderness without a unifying grand strategy that brings the country together. Why do we have a military? How should we use our military? How big of a military should we have? When should we go to war? And how do we have effective diplomacy around what issues? We don't have that same sense of consensus in the country today. And this was becoming aware to me when I was serving in Ranger Regiment. So I was in late 97 until 99. I was a lieutenant. I was a company XO in the 75th Ranger Regiment. So most of you will remember that in August of 1998, America's embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. Some of you may know, but most of the world does not realize that was Al-Qaeda that bombed our embassies. That was their first major op against the United States. And given the units I was in, we were all pretty amped up and expecting that we would be going to deal with that. And the reality is the FBI dealt with it. And I think about world history, it's probably very different because of that national command authority level decision. Unfortunately, the world learned a lot more about Al-Qaeda than they may have ever needed to know based on our reaction to it. So the reaction to threats to our country, getting that right is very high stakes. When you look at what I got after that, though, I made captain, I go to the 101st, and without ever authorizing combat in Kosovo, America deployed to Kosovo. June will be the 20th year that America's been in Kosovo, fighting for Kosovo's sovereignty. And my main peeve with it is it highlights the passive-aggressive nature of Congress's inaction. If we're going to commit our men and women in military to fight for our country, Congress should authorize it. They say, well, we spend the money. That's the passive-aggressive part. You don't want to own the mission, but you cut the checks. And that's going on over and over. It really burnt me up on a number of fronts. And for the sake of time, I'll skip that. Bottom line is I got out of the Army and said, I'm going to go do something different. And when I get out of the Army and I get into business, you keep seeing the consequences of the policy. We've been under the same authorization of military force since right after 9/11 that authorizes us to fight Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. We went to Iraq, and frankly, as a grand strategy piece, a limited mission with a limited objective, like find the weapons of mass destruction and seize them, is a limited mission. But create a Democratic Republic of Iraq is an unlimited mission. And thankfully, many of you who probably deployed there came a lot closer to making that a reality. That's a testament to the strength of our military, the innovation and creativity, and the trillions of dollars we poured into the place, than to really a rational strategy. So for that reason, I was very disengaged from politics in a couple related ones since 2005. So fast forward, now I'm here in Congress. Ultimately, I decide, as I started to assess whether or not to run for office, that is one of the overarching reasons why I felt like maybe I could make a difference on this topic. I think our men and women in Congress, or men and women in uniform, the loyalty of putting our whole nation behind the missions that we commit them to. And if you say that the same authorization of military force could be used to create a Democratic Republic of Iraq and yet have another Secretary of State say that air conditioners are a bigger threat than ISIS, it's probably the mission, right? You don't have a real mission statement. And so whatever the mission statement is, Congress needs to unite behind it. And we're dealing with that, for example, in Yemen. Congress voted and said, because we can read plain English, that Houthi rebels, which are Iranian proxies, are not affiliates of Al-Qaeda. How do we know that? They're fighting a civil war against affiliates of Al-Qaeda. And who are we helping? We're actually helping the people we're authorized to defeat, which is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So Congress finally got that through, and of course the nature of that would require the president to sign it. The president opposes it. And so we've still got this tension between Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution. In a way, it was designed in, but our founders were so passionate about this that Federal 69 deals with it. And they drew the main distinction between a president and a king as the ability to declare our nation's wars. So I really think when our nation declares a war, when our nation is behind a unifying mission, we have phenomenal success. And the reality is, because we have funded our military broadly at a reasonably high level, and we have phenomenally talented people in an all-volunteer force, we get great results even when the top-level mission isn't all that it should be. But then I'm going to finish on this. I think the problem is we keep cutting the checks, we keep spending money on the military, and we do that in a way that's problematic in a couple ways. One is we spend more money than we have, and we do it because we spend a lot on our military. We have an unlimited number of missions in an unlimited number of places, so we don't pare it down and prioritize the strength. But the other thing is, through political negotiations, we've had essentially one party say, if you want $1 for the military, then you have to give us $1 for non-military spending, which is not a rational linkage, but it's leverage. The Soviet Union proved that deficits do matter. That wasn't that long ago. You know, back when I was a Cold Warrior, we thought they were number 2. We knew we could beat them, but we never actually proved it on the battlefield. We didn't have to because they went bankrupt, because deficits do matter. And then the other way that it's problematic in terms of spending is there's so little accountability. Even within DOD, anyone who served knows there's fraud, waste, and abuse. And, you know, at about $700 billion a year in funding, we finally find that DOD can't officially account for over $100 billion a year. And the idea, if you think about a publicly traded company, if you had a publicly listed stock company on the New York Stock Exchange or wherever, and they couldn't pass an audit, they wouldn't stay listed. If they had an audit and found that kind of problem, the entire board of directors would be fired and probably in jail. So I am looking at a piece of legislation that would say any year when we cannot pass legislation or cannot pass an audit in DOD, we would reduce the number of 4 stars, 3 stars, and 2 stars by 10% each, and you can't affect the number of 1-star accessions. So we keep getting fresh blood. Maybe the next line can do it, and then when the whole place is commanded by colonels, maybe somebody will be accountable. So we'll see what the odds are of passage. My first bill still hasn't got a vote, which said Congress shall have no other health benefit than the VA health benefit. We haven't quite been able to get a vote on that one, or co-sponsors. And then the last one I'm offering is, as related to this. In Afghanistan, we've been there for a long time. Many of my friends who've gone many times to Afghanistan will speak highly of people that they've built close relationships with who are just authentically good, decent human beings. But then at the top level, it always gets political. And at some level, the government they're getting a lot of money coming into Afghanistan, and they don't want to see a lot of money stop coming into Afghanistan from us. So there's always a political reason that we stay. And I think we can stay there for 50% less. And so that's the last amendment I'll be offering, which is that we will reduce spending in Afghanistan by 50%. So with that, I think it's an honor to be able to speak with you. It's an honor to serve our country in a way I never thought I would get the chance to do. And I look forward to connecting with any of you anytime. So thanks, and God bless you all.
So again, we're really blessed to have all these members of Congress trekking down here to speak to us. It's a very busy day on Capitol Hill, and it means a lot to both CVA and VoteVets. They came out. So we're still waiting a couple minutes for Congressman Gaetz. He is on his way. He will be here. But Congressman Davidson talked about the audit of the Pentagon. It's one of my favorite topics, particularly some of the things they've initially found. So the Army inventory system left off about 38 Black Hawk helicopters, and they found it in kind of the first wave of the audit. To put that in perspective, the Japanese Army only has 34 Black Hawk helicopters. And a lot of folks have kind of wondered, why hasn't the DoD done an audit? This is such one of these common sense things. There's really not a lot of public opposition on Capitol Hill to doing an audit. But if you think about it, that's 38 Black Hawk helicopters that the United States doesn't need to buy. There maybe needs to be discussion of whether or not they should buy them in the first place. But even if you assume current force levels, that's a lot less money that's going out the door. And so there's a lot of these common sense solutions to problems, in the defense world and the foreign policy world that just never happen because there's just quiet resistance to it, and there's also this public resistance to it. So our next speaker is here. It is Congressman Matt Gaetz, and I have to say that when Congressman Gaetz was first elected, he really wasn't on our radar. We have a very strong Florida chapter, and where's our Florida team? Raise your hand, they're kind of scattered about, but we wound up doing a town hall with Congressman Gaetz in March of last year, and Diego, where's Diego? Diego moderated it. He's our senior person in Florida, and he said, this guy really knows his stuff, but he didn't use stuff because we were in the Army and Marine Corps, and I'm bilingual, I speak English and profanity, so he used another word. But he has been a leader on a lot of issues. He is somebody behind the scenes that's doing a lot of interesting stuff with foreign policy, with Veterans Affairs, and a lot of other issues. And we're very happy to have him here today. So with that, I'd just like to welcome to the stage Congressman Matt Gaetz.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you so much to CVA and VoteVets for having me here. Thank you to every veteran and military family member here. Your service to the greatest nation in human history inspires the best within us because you are the best among us. You're the heroes who've paid for the safety and prosperity of your fellow citizens with blood, sweat, pain, sacrifice, and an absolutely unmatched American courage. Your urgent mission now to advance a pro-veteran agenda is among the most critical in our nation. And while there is much to do, you have scored striking victories during the Trump presidency. You've mobilized a generation of veterans to vigorously engage in the most vibrant democracy that exists in the world. You've converted patriotic energy into meaningful legislation to expand VA choice, and it's the law of the land today. You've demanded VA accountability, and you got it. Over 10,000 incompetent, lazy, corrupt bureaucrats at the VA got to hear two of President Trump's favorite words: you're fired. Your work ensures that our brave service members come home to the hero's welcome and receive the hero's care that they deserve. My district, thanks you especially, I represent the highest concentration of active duty military in the country. The Blue Angels are my constituents. The fiercest weapons delivered on time and on target by the United States Air Force are developed at Eglin Air Force Base in my home county. Almost every part of life in my district is favorably impacted by our connection to the military. Air Commandos lead our Boy Scout troops. Army Rangers coach our youth softball leagues. The deacon in my church maintains the flight line. My chief of staff is a military spouse, and the neighbor right now feeding my cat trains Marines how to disarm bombs. And it is on their behalf that I say thank you, President Trump, for rebuilding our military and passing the most robust national defense budget in American history. But a well-funded force does not need to be so well-worn. Today, our military is overstretched, over-deployed, and overexerted. Growing up where I've seen my whole life what endless deployments and unfocused wars really mean for our most patriotic fellow Americans. I know you will have experienced some of these things or seen them. I've seen all of them. Tearful goodbyes at airports, bargaining with God for the safe return of loved ones, parenting disrupted marriages destroyed, more counselors needed at our schools, drug abuse, domestic abuse, veteran suicide, shattered limbs, broken hearts, and grieving desperate families at Walter Reed Hospital, caskets draped in flags, Gold Star families in mourning, and then roads, parks, and halls of learning named in permanent remembrance of the fallen. The fog of war is no fog to me or any of the 700,000 people I serve in the Florida Panhandle. It's not hazy. We see the impact of war every day among the people we love who have shaped our lives. It's a stark reminder that the unmatched freedoms we enjoy are not free. They are bought with the blood of American patriots. And it is our solemn duty and our highest responsibility to make sure that when this sacred currency is spent, it is only done when absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, prior to the election of Donald Trump, our decision makers have fallen short of this standard, demonstrating a tragic recklessness with the treasure of our nation and the blood of our patriots. Consider this, since 2001, the United States government has spent nearly $6 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraq War alone cost $4 trillion, not to mention the immeasurable cost of broken and lost lives. To give you some perspective, $4 trillion, what we've spent in Iraq, is more than the entire tax revenue of our nation last year. It would be enough to completely overhaul our nation's infrastructure, more than the entire market capitalization of Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Facebook combined. It is more than all of our nation's student loan debt and credit card debt combined. It is nearly 10 times our enormous $419 billion trade deficit with China, a country that was rapidly expanding without firing a shot while we were engaged in far-flung wars in the Middle East. We have been in Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades. It is the longest war in our nation's history, longer than the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, both world wars combined. American soldiers are dying in Afghanistan today who weren't even born when the war began. In Afghanistan, after 2 decades have passed, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of American lives lost, the situation on the ground is actually getting worse. A recent study for Congress found that U.S.-backed forces in Afghanistan control just 56% of administrative districts. That's down from 72% in 2015. Civilian deaths are also up, and despite $8 billion spent on counter-narcotics, the growth of opioid fields has not been slowed. One would think that the cautionary tales of Afghanistan and Iraq would make the war lobby and so-called national security experts more cautious about U.S. involvement, but they would be wrong. Instead, Hillary Clinton, backed by Republican war hawks, launched a regime change operation in Libya, removing the strongman dictator Muammar Gaddafi. That might sound humanitarian in theory, but there is nothing humanitarian or humane about the slave trade that is going on in Libya today or the migrant crisis that has brought Europe to its knees. The same thought leaders that were equally desperate for regime change in Syria sought the removal of Bashar al-Assad. And like Gaddafi, there's no question that Assad is a brutal dictator and an evil man. But the problem with these misguided calls for regime change is the lack of a superior alternative. The main beneficiaries of such an intervention would be ISIS and related terror groups fighting Assad. Luckily, the war lobby did not get its way in Syria, largely thanks to President Trump, the only major presidential candidate who spoke against the idea. The so-called experts behind our failed foreign policy have not learned from their mistakes because they have not been accountable for them. And so today, the saber-rattling persists toward Venezuela, Yemen, and Iran. As we look to these countries, it is our task to ensure that we don't just recount the past mistakes of others, but that we learn from them, and that we must be resolved not to start unwise wars or put our military in unwinnable or endless conflicts. We know from the tragic experiences that oppressors like Maduro, Rouhani, and even Kim Jong-un will use military conflict to scapegoat their own failures, export violence, and deny the desires of their own people to seek and taste freedom. in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and beyond, we should not fool ourselves into thinking that unwilling or unreliable local fighters necessitate the involvement of American troops. The examples of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, just to name a few, teach us that it is an illusion to think just beyond the life of every dictator lies a prosperous, inclusive democracy, rather than generations of anarchy, violence, terrorism, and chaos. The lessons we have learned should not be considered in isolation. Put together, they form and outline a successful Trump doctrine of American foreign policy. The Trump doctrine falls into 4 pillars. First, we build and maintain the strongest military edge over everyone, period. Second, American citizens come first. Foreign nations and special interests, no matter how much we may love them, don't call the shots in our country. Third, national security must begin at home, and national security is always linked to economic security. Fourth, an America First policy is not an isolationist or utopian policy. Others must know that we will respond and we will win. So the first pillar, an American foreign policy, is one of caution, common sense, and peace through overwhelming strength. I never want to send America's troops into a fair fight. That means providing the funding, equipment, infrastructure, and training and arms to deliver decisive victory every single time. The United States military must and will remain the biggest, strongest, and most lethal fighting force in human history, and we can never allow that to be in question. The second pillar, America First, means Americans first. This is a simple yet powerful principle. The interests of American citizens come before the demands of foreign interests abroad and special interests at home. It means not invading Venezuela because the idea of invasion is popular in Venezuela. It means not fighting a proxy war on behalf of a rich Persian Gulf monarchy. It means not sacrificing American patriots on the altar of multinational oil companies who need a profit boost. In short, a truly America First foreign policy is not a lobbyist-first foreign policy. It is not a military-industrial first foreign policy. It is not an armchair general cable news first foreign policy. It is an America First foreign policy. The third pillar, an America First foreign policy must recognize that national security begins here in our great nation. As the president rightly points out, economic security is national security. This is why President Trump has worked so hard to secure our industrial sector from intellectual property theft and refuses to allow our nation and our workers to be taken advantage of with one-sided trade deals. I find it amazing that the trade war seems to be the only war that some of the so-called experts inside Washington seem to be against. Focus closer to home means that the Trump doctrine would prioritize the U.S. border with Mexico over sending our troops to fight and die on the Saudi border with Yemen. Stronger borders, energy dominance, and a thriving American economy do more to secure American security than ill-fated interventionist excursions in the name of regime change and nation building. We should focus on our nation building right here in America, strengthening our homeland. The fourth and final pillar, an America First foreign policy is not an isolationist foreign policy. If our enemies mistook a more precise and focused America as disengaged or disinterested or recoiled, and they tested our capability, they would find us recoiled like a viper, ready to strike instantly with extreme lethality and purpose. Military action, including intervention, is always on the table, but only as a last resort, and only when there is a direct, concrete, and grave threat to the security of the United States or one of our allies. Just as the threat must be clear and concrete and well-defined, so must be the objectives of our military operations. We have to know what victory looks like in order to achieve it. Freedom is the most precious thing in the world. And it's for that reason that freedom must be fought for and won by those who yearn to live it most. Freedom cannot be America's gift to the world, purchased with the blood of U.S. service members alone. For oppressed people anywhere in the world to live any lasting freedom, they must be the driving force to make it happen. They must fight and die for it. They must bury their relatives over it. For generations, they have to tell stories of the patriots and brave people who fought and won it. Only then will any people be able to cherish freedom so much that they will never allow a strong man to take it away ever again. Plenty of DC pundits and Beltway hawks talk in terms of toughness to support American military action. They say we have moral obligations to intervene. Real morality and real toughness is standing up to the pro-war special interests and globalist power brokers. Real morality is affirming forever that the blood of American troops is not for sale to anyone at any cost. As I travel home to North Florida this week, I will meet with commanding officers. They will brief me on the missions and preparations undertaken, and if called to combat, my neighbors will go first, and they'll fight the hardest, and I am incredibly proud of them. But as policymakers, it's our job to fight harder in Washington, to understand the deep consequences of U.S. military force, both at home and around the world. President Trump is staying true to the instincts he expressed when campaigning as an America First anti-interventionist Republican. Today's wiser, more cautious Trump doctrine will rile some of the so-called experts in this town, but it is supported by an overwhelming share of Americans. As President Trump's measured approach in Venezuela, Syria, and Iran proceeds, it will make our nation stronger. And we must continue to build on the Trump achievements in developing a 21st century foreign policy. Elected office holders of both parties have sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. Together we can do so much more and so much better. This means not sending the next generation of patriots to fight unwinnable wars for unknowable gain. There always are places we could invade, people we could rescue, nations we could build. A clear-eyed look at the threats we face proves that peace through strength also means strength through peace. The Trump doctrine means continuing to rebuild our military and maintaining our dominance. It means listening to the American people, not the siren song of Beltway pundits and armchair generals. It means taking a clear-eyed look at American interests, always focused on the well-being of our own great nation before we volunteer our brave soldiers to be the world's policemen. It means knowing that sometimes the fight is just and worth fighting, and knowing when America fights, America will win. This plan will make the world safer, more stable, and more self-reliant, instead of expecting and receiving American largesse at every turn. The Trump doctrine means that we must always put America and the American people first. Our heroic servicemen and women deserve it, and the enduring prosperity of our nation depends on it. Thank you all for your service. Thank you for being in the fight. God bless you, and God bless America.
Good afternoon. It's good to be up here again. I will do the closing remarks. We won't make it too long, but I wanted to do first a round of thank yous. Where's the VoteVets staff at? Rick, Kate, General Eaton. Give these guys a round of applause. These guys, they work really hard. To our volunteers at VoteVets, thank you guys for coming. One of the first things I ever did in politics was I went to a press conference to see my senator at a VA hospital in Pittsburgh, and they actually would not let me inside. Said I wasn't a member of the press. So I said, "Are you really not going to let me in?" And he said, "Yeah, you can either walk out of here now, or this police officer will take you out of here." And I said, "Are you really threatening to arrest me to speak to my U.S. senator?" Basically, he was. So I walked outside, and I got all the TV cameras there, and I said, "I want to know why I'm good enough to fight a war in Iraq, but not ask my senator a question." So to the VoteVets members who came, thank you guys for coming. This is the principal part of what we do, which is to give veterans a voice in politics. So thank you guys as well. To the CVA staff, Dan, where's the Mike Oscar Mike? Is she in here? Kyle. And this is going to surprise, and to the Koch network, thank you for also working with us. I want to give you guys a round of applause also to the CVA team. Thank you guys for making this possible. CVA veterans, thank you guys as well. I know our guys had a great time working with you. I was talking to Dan because I'm not sure how we got here. Last cycle, we spent millions of dollars against each other in certain Senate races, and said very impolite things to each other on Twitter. A lot. I think I used to do a lot more, fighting on TV than I do now, and certain people that we would argue with all the time, and I'm sure that went both ways. And I wanted to make sure you all who participated understood how we sort of got here. I think C-SPAN had called us, and they wanted me to go on television with Dan, and I was like, no way. There was no way I was going to go on and get into a yelling match with concerned veterans. It was post-election. I wanted to go fishing. I asked if Will Fisher could go. Will did. Will was like, gosh, John, Dan and I had a great conversation on foreign policy. We're kind of on the same page. And we had just come out of the Florida election where we were VoteVets and CVA were a part of a coalition in Florida on allowing felons to vote. In the state of Florida, if you had a conviction for a felony, you could no longer vote even when you got out of prison. And I think that was the first time we realized that there was some synergy. And then the Yemen coalition, this right-left alliance where, you've got the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that, is cutting up journalists in embassies, funding a war in Yemen with U.S. military equipment that Congress has provided basically no oversight for, and civilians were being killed, and the Iranians were on the other side. And I think how many of y'all was in Iraq? I know I was, but I think we all remember what it was like to get shot at by Iranian-made weapons and by Sunni terrorists. And so, knock, knock, I'm not sure what the surprise in this town is, but Iranians have been involved in killing U.S. forces since 2003. In fact, you can make the argument that they won the Iraq War. So I know there's a news flash in this town right now, but I think some of us, we have those experiences, and we found this great coalition in Yemen. So I sent Will to talk to Dan, and, we did this sort of sit down and sort of hatched this idea of, could all of our division and all of our fighting make this powerful? And there's nothing, we all take our experiences from the war. There's nothing that any of us can do to bring back people that have passed away. And there's always that argument of someone saying, do not tell me that my son or daughter died for something that didn't matter. And that's not for me to say. What's for me to say is maybe someone else's kid doesn't have to. And, what we're talking about here is a long-term coalition that redefines how this country goes to war in the future. And we're going to fight you guys, CVA. We're going to fight you guys on some issues. That's okay. Because the issue that matters to us most and why we were founded in 2006 was because we didn't agree with the Iraq War. The Iraq War was an intervention of nation building and humanitarianism. It had nothing to do with American security or 9/11. And what I can tell you is we'll stand with you guys 100% on this issue. I look forward to arguing with you guys on other issues because it's what gives us the opportunity to work so well on this. And I'll leave you with a story. When I started VoteVets, and it's hard for me because we're in the fight every day, and sometimes it's hard to look at somebody that you don't agree with on 12 things. It's hard to sit down on that one thing. But if that one thing you can get done and make it great, it's more important than the 12 things you don't agree on. And this old man, he walked up to me in 2007 when I used to argue with a certain Fox News host on all the talk shows about the war. And he says to me, "Are you John Stoltz?" I said, "Yeah." And he says, "I want to shake your hand." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you served in Iraq." And I said, "Okay. Are you a veteran?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, where did you serve?" He said, "I was a Marine in the Pacific in World War II." I was like, "Well, man, I want to shake your hand." And he said, "Well, you volunteered. I was drafted." I was like, No. I want to shake your hand because you were, a jarhead in the Pacific. We got any Marines in here? Gosh, it's too many. Why didn't you guys sign up for the military? Anyway. So he said to me, do you know what it means to be a veteran? And at the time, I was having a hard time. Like the first time I came home from Iraq, I was having a really hard time. It was hard. I met Hal back then. He knew I was intense. I'm intense now, but I was more intense then. It was just hard. It was hard to come back to a war that everybody thought was over. It was hard to come back from a war where everyone thought there was weapons of mass destruction. It was hard to come back from a war where your generation wasn't serving. And so this guy says to me, do you know what it means to be a veteran? And I said, tell me. He said, when I was a little boy, I went to a parade, and I got to shake the hand of a Civil War veteran. So I was like, so I'm shaking the hand of a World War II veteran who shook the hand of a Civil War veteran. I'm like, does that work? And I'm like, it does kind of work. And he said, but you know what that Civil War veteran told me? He said when he was a little kid, he got to meet a Revolutionary War veteran. So I was like, so I'm meeting a World War II veteran who'd met a Civil War veteran who'd met a Revolutionary War veteran. He says, yes. And now I'm shaking the hand of an Iraq War veteran. That's why I wanted to shake your hand. And I did the math, and I'm like, that's really incredible. And he said, you know what it means to be a veteran? And I said, tell me. He says, it means you have more in common with an 85-year-old man like me than you do any 25-year-old walking down the street in New York City. And I was like, that's so true. And even if we disagree on 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 issues, and we disagree on the president, there's more that's going to unite us than divide us. Because we all believe in the United States. We all believe in our Constitution. And no different than when you served in the military. And I just wanted to leave the CVA guys with that story on behalf of VoteVets to let you guys know, as long as you guys want to work to restrain our foreign policy and stop endless wars, we'll stand there and fight with you, even though we know we're going to fight and disagree on 20 different things. So with that said, I just wanted to thank you guys for coming, and we look forward to working with your guys' team again. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. If we could have Team CVA and Team VoteVets hold, we're going to do some photos, but everybody else is welcome to leave at your leisure. The program is complete. Thank you.